I am real excited to introduce Martin Durham, a friend of mine and someone that I have lots of respect for in ministry. And I recently, Martin, when I was talking about you to our congregation, I said, "You're my favorite gospel preacher." And so I'm excited just to spend this time together. And so welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the warm welcome very much. Yeah.
When Joshua Tepper, who was on staff here, and we came to Poland to meet you, and then we walked from Auschwitz to, well, where was the place where we ended up?
Malinovice.
Yeah, I can never say that word.
Yeah.
And so how many miles was that walk?
That was 100 kilometers. So
Long way.
It was a long way. A long way. In 3 days.
Yes. 3 days of walking. I think I came in midday the second day and barely made it to the finish line. So I am, but what a great time that was, and raise some money for ILI and what you're doing in Europe. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to start off, when we were walking together, you shared your testimony with me, and it was just fantastic. And as someone who comes from an investment banking background before ministry, and you have a similar work history, tell us a little bit about what you were doing, and then God calling you to leave, because you had a pretty big job there in London, and just tell us a little bit about that, and then how God called you out to go into full-time ministry.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for the support of Mount Bethel and all those who prayed and contributed to that walk. It made a big difference for us. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, I was in banking straight from school, and ended up in corporate banking in the head office with Barclays Bank in London. Yeah, that was where I was. And I came to Christ at 19, and a remarkable time for me, of course, making that decision to follow Christ. And through being discipled, I had this growing sense of a call to something different. And really the one of the key moments of seeing that was when we had the visit, actually, of an American preacher to our church who was just passing through. He was a street preacher, and I was just a young Christian, and he challenged us to go out on the streets in London. And for me, I'd never even seen street preaching. I was fascinated by this. So we went to Leicester Square in London, which is one of the busiest areas, I guess, a bit like Times Square in America, sure. I guess. And he started preaching, and people started to gather. And as a young Christian, I was trying to look busy and look like I was doing something. And I managed to bump into two Christian guys who were passing through Leicester Square. Just two guys walking past. Turned out they were Christian. So we just talked, and we talked a lot about football, proper football, back. And you call it soccer, I think, but it's and it was great because from a distance it looked like I was witnessing, but I wasn't actually. We were just talking about football. And then this preacher, he stopped preaching and he walked straight across to me, and I could see him coming, and I thought, oh no, I've been found out. I'm going to have to tell him. And I introduced these two guys that I just met, said, oh, they're Christians. And this preacher, he said to them, he said, oh, that's great. Why don't you come and stand on this box in the corner of this Leicester Square and tell your story? And you could see the colour drain out of their faces, and they started to make excuses and got a train to catch, maybe next time. And then this preacher, he said, I'll tell you what, Martin will do it first, and then you can do it. And my heart kind of sank really, because I thought, I can't say no to this. And I had this long walk to this box in Leicester Square, loads of people around, stood on this box. And I don't remember what I said that day, but it was like God ignited something within me as I just sought to proclaim the gospel in whatever way I could. Something happened inside, and it was the start of a journey for me. And again, being in banking at that time, I had this kind of growing sense that there was something more that God wanted me to do. And to the point of, I had an invitation to leave the bank and join a ministry.
I love this story.
And it was like, this is fantastic. This is exactly what I want to do, to share the gospel all the time. And I went and told my wife, Rachel, and shared with her. And she looked at me and said, I don't have any peace about this. I thought, that can't be right. It was infuriating, to tell you the truth. And I said to my wife, I said, I'll tell you what, I'll go and talk to the pastor. He will understand. And I went to our pastor, and he looked at me and said, I don't have any peace about this. And so I realized at that point, as hard as it was, that it wasn't right for me to leave the bank at that time. And so I had to kind of leave it for that moment. And in 90, well, that was the end of 90, kind of late 96. And in 97, my wife Rachel and I had our first child. He was born, and of course, much rejoicing when you have your first child. And his name was George, and he became quite sick as a baby, even to the point of he didn't come out of hospital. When I went to kind of bring them home, he was already in intensive care, and they didn't know what was wrong with him. They couldn't work it out, but they told us he was very sick. And within a couple of days, he had died. He lost his life, and it was an agonizing moment for me and for my wife Rachel, particularly when they gave me his body. I remember just collapsing to my knees, and incredible physical pain, and a desperate moment for us. And yet God gave me an incredible peace at that time as well, and for my wife Rachel. Incredible peace that I couldn't describe or explain, as the Bible talks about. Within a year, we'd had our next child, Annie, our daughter, who, when she was born, they thought she had the same illness. They didn't know what it was, and she was taken to a top children's hospital in London. But within a week, they had released her. She was perfectly well. She's 24 years old now, and just got married last year, and we thank God for that. And then my wife was pregnant with our third child, and this really is quite significant in the story of the call to leave the bank, really, because when she was pregnant with our third child, in the pregnancy, the hospital in London, Great Ormond Street, top children's hospital, came to us and said, we know why George died now, and it was a defect in the DNA. And they said, if you're carrying a boy, then there is a 50-50 chance he will live. I mean, it really was 50-50. He'll either be sick and he will die, there's no cure, or he will live. And Jody, I felt God say to me quite clearly he would live. And in the bank, as my colleagues were around me, none of them who were following Christ, I was saying to them, God has told me he's going to be well, because we knew that we were carrying a boy. Hospital had tried to persuade us to abort, and we didn't want to do that. And when he was born, Billy, he was born on the 17th of August, and with this illness, they can't test quick enough whether they have it. You just have to wait and see if it develops. And so we stayed in hospital with him. Within a couple of days, he became very sick and was taken to intensive care. And the most precious 24 hours of my life, that of my wife as well, was to cradle Billy literally for 24 hours until he took his last breath. And he died in my arms, 1:56 in the morning. And I remember just screaming out to God. And it's funny how the body does things. I screamed quietly because I knew it was 1:56 in the morning. The hospital was quiet. And the lowest I've ever felt in my life. Within a week, I was having lunch with my in-laws, my wife's parents, and Rachel, my wife. And I had to leave. I was in such a desperate state. And I went home, just sat in an armchair like this, just sat at home. And on the table next to me was some posts, some mail that had come through. We hadn't opened anything in a week. But on the top there was a letter I recognized. It was a circular newsletter from an evangelist who had visited our church years before, well before George. And I thought, I'll just open this. And I opened it, and it said, "Dear Martin." And I thought, that's strange. He has never written to me personally before. And he said, I'm in Russia at the moment, and I'm working with some young people. I'm resting in my tent, and God has arrested me to pray for you. I don't know why, but I know I have to write and tell you. And in that moment, I heard God's voice, not audibly, but it was so clear. "Martin, I love you. I know you don't understand, but trust me." And my wife walked in at that point, and she said to me, I know it's not true, but it feels like God has abandoned us. And I showed her the letter, and we just cried. We cried together. And from that moment, there was this, again, a gradual sense of call to leave the bank and to devote my time purely to ministry. And different things happened. But for me, the struggle was, I really believe God said to me that Billy was going to be well. Could I trust myself to hear from God again? And it was almost like, God, it needs to be so clear. It needs to be so abundantly clear if I'm going to leave the bank and leave a good job and do this. And we took a time of prayer retreat, which was amazing. My wife and I took a weekend together, spent time apart to start with, and God took us to the same place in Scripture and told us exactly the same thing. So when we came back together, it was incredibly moving to know what God was saying. But even then I was wrestling with it and saying, God, I just need to know, I need to be sure. And I prayed one day. I was on the Underground, the Tube, we call it in London, going to work. Prayed, Lord, please.
That's the subway, right?
The subway, sorry, yeah, subway. The Tube is the correct name, I understand. But anyway, and I was praying, God, please, just one piece of confirmation, one piece more. I know that I'm doing the right thing. And one of the management team at the bank said, let's go out to lunch together. I don't normally work with him, but it had been a really busy time. He said, I just want to take you out to lunch. Not a believer. And we're having lunch together, talking about work. And he suddenly stopped in the middle of lunch and looked at me and said, so where will Martin Durham be in 5 years' time? Have you ever thought about ordination to the ministry? And then he carried on talking about work. You could have heard my jaw hit the floor, really. And it was like, did I imagine that? But it was so clear. And so I went and told my wife, and I thought, okay, well, we need to go and talk to the pastor. He had no peace last time. And I prepared all my notes. I had 8 pages of notes, evidence of all that had happened. And I sat down with him, pulled the notes out, and he said, put those away. I don't need to see that. I know this is the right time. So I wrote out my resignation for the bank, and I was leaving the bank to stepping into a ministry where I had to raise my own support. And we had just taken on a mortgage. We had just had our 4th child, a daughter, Eliza, who's 21 today, beautiful and healthy. And I had no guarantee of income. And I said to my wife, I remember so clearly, I said, what am I doing? What am I doing leaving this job and going into ministry? And she said to me, we have heard what God has said. We just need to go forward and be faithful. You want a spouse like that, don't you? Who just... And so I handed him a resignation. And then I had to work for a month, work out my notice. And on the penultimate day, so I just finished my second last day, came home, walked through the door, and on the floor in front of me was the mail. I picked it up. There was some junk mail. And I went to throw it away, and I just flicked it over. And on the back of this envelope was an advertisement, a commercial, on the back. And it was a picture of bankers walking across London Bridge towards where I used to work. And in big white letters on this picture, it just said, don't be a banker. And I looked at it and I showed my wife Rachel, and we just laughed. It was like the penultimate day, and it was almost like God saying, you're on the right track. Yeah. And God spoke to us in such a clear way, which I knew I needed. Isn't God gracious? Mm-hmm. He knew I needed to know beyond any doubt. And that was in 2001. So I left the bank at that point, and I thought, what am I going to do now? I started to go on the streets and talk to people about Jesus. But I tell you, in those 21 years now, it feels like God has packed in 42 years. And I should say, my testimony is that God has provided for our every need in those 21 years. From the very first day, He has always provided. So it's been quite a journey out of banking. But it's all about Him, really, And one final thing on that, I am thankful. If I had left the bank, if I'd been disobedient to God and left the bank, against what my pastor and my wife were saying before our boys had died. I don't know where I'd be today. I wouldn't be sitting here, I'm sure. I was a different man after that time with our children. And so God's timing is so important, isn't it? So important. And trusting him for the timing.
So I wasn't planning on going this direction, but you said something that I think is important. And the reason I love this testimony is because my life followed time-wise. I left and started in 2001, and that's having some of those same inner struggles. And I experienced a different kind of death. And isn't it interesting how God uses those difficult, really difficult, feeling like you're in the dark moments to really shape your heart and prepare you for what's to come?
Yeah.
It's amazing. And
yeah, I think brokenness is such a key part, really, for leadership. And in that moment for us with our children, and I'm so thankful to God for those two boys, we could depend on no one else. I mean, I could lean on no one else, and only God. That's right. Only God. And even today, people still say, how did you get through that? They still, how did you not lose your faith? And yet for us, our faith grew stronger through it because he was so real in the midst of that suffering.
That's right. I love that story, and I just wanted to share it with people who are in our room with us right now, but also with the church will be able to see this our time together. So, talk about how you got connected, because ILI is probably one of our largest ministry supports here at Mount Bethel, and talk about just briefly how you got from you accepting the calling to ministry to being a part of ILI.
Yes. So when I left banking, and I think, what am I going to do now? Within 2 years, I had an invitation through one of the former ILI directors, who's now with the Lord in glory, an invitation to go to Atlanta, Carrollton, just outside, to take part in an international conference with the International Leadership Institute, which I knew nothing about. But it was such an instrumental, significant time for me, because part of that time was seeking God for vision for your life. And for me, as I was coming into that time with Wes Griffin and others who had a deep impact on me, and the Lord did through them, I was coming in with a box of jigsaw pieces, thinking, okay, I know God's called me out. How does this all piece together? Where am I heading? I knew from our prayer retreat for my wife and I, God had told us clearly, and we wrote it down at the time, that the ministry would be European based, which was funny for us because we knew no one in Europe. We really knew no one in Europe, but we wrote it down. And I remember so clearly being there at that time of that conference. We had some time one afternoon, 3 hours it was, to go out and just be alone with God. And I sat on this veranda looking into the woodland, and I had this picture of all these jigsaw pieces. And I remember starting to write things down as I sensed God putting things into place. And I remember asking God, what is it that's burning in my heart? And I wrote down England on fire with the gospel. Yeah. And as I was writing it, I just sensed the Holy Spirit, I suppose, say to me, Martin, look higher. And I was looking out to the trees, and I just moved my eyes to the tree tops, And I remember just automatically crossing out England and writing Europe, crossing out on fire and writing ablaze. And as I wrote that, it just kind of settled in my heart. I knew that this was the vision God was giving for me. When I said the vision, not for me to complete that, but that's the picture of his preferred future for the continent of Europe, that it would be ablaze with the gospel, that there wouldn't be one person not in the sound of the gospel, that everyone would have an opportunity to hear and make a response. And so for me, it was a very significant time. You can go to many conferences, can't you? But what I've seen with ILI is that it truly makes a difference in the lives of young leaders and senior leaders as well. And so I committed myself to kind of walk alongside ILI. Wes invited me to get more involved, and to the point now of leading the ministry in Europe. So that's very much part of my role, along with other things, the ministry I'm involved with in the UK and Europe.
So what's God doing in the work y'all are doing right now? Where do you see God moving? And just tell us what's happening with the ministry in Europe.
Yeah. Well, Europe is a fascinating place. I do believe, maybe I'm slightly biased, but I believe it is the neediest continent for the gospel. We have around 745 million people, and conservatively, perhaps 2% would be practicing evangelical Christians. Great need. It's a continent in crisis in many respects, politically and ideologically, demographically, shifting and changing. It's where Christianity meets Islam, and yet secularism is the big thing. Great needs. And the ministry that I'm leading at the moment, which kind of started with my call, it's called K180, Kerygma 180. Kerygma being a Greek word used uniquely in the New Testament, of course, in the context of the gospel. It means proclamation, 180 degrees, calling people to turn from death to life. And my role with ILI is very much part of that. But we also train young evangelists across Europe, and are engaged in creative street ministry as well. So we have teams in different places doing that. And for me, a lot of our focus is on young adults, those with a sense of call to evangelist or to leadership, because there are young adults out there who they want to make a difference with their lives. They want their lives to count for something in Jesus' name. And it excites me. So despite the fact that it can look quite barren and, there are many challenges, but I believe there's an army of young people, particularly, and of course there are older people as well, but young people who just want someone to run alongside them. And particularly ILI with the leadership stuff and the other stuff we're doing with young evangelists, that is our heart's desire, to run alongside these young leaders, young evangelists, as they move forward in ministry. So not just have a conference and teach them, but actually stick with them for the longer term, as much as they want that, of course. So we are seeing some really exciting things happen, with young people who are catching the vision, if you like. So with our History Makers, which is part of ILI, and again, that was part of that 100-kilometre walk, raising money for History Makers, where we are investing in Indigenous young leaders. So in their countries, bringing mentors in their countries, trying to keep everything Indigenous, but running alongside them so they can make a difference in their land. And it's exciting. One story just that springs to mind, because there's so many things you don't hear and you only hear later. And it's something I heard 8 years later. And I only heard this about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, where one leader, a pastor, contacted me from Romania and said, I just need to let you know, I was at History Makers 8 years ago, and God spoke to me so powerfully. From leaving that time, I went off and planted a church. I just went off and planted a church. That church has been growing and flourishing, and I want you to know that was a direct result of History Makers. In fact, we've just opened an orphanage which is touching 150 families in our town. And I'm reading this thinking, I had no idea. One young leader who came to that event, who heard God's voice. Another young guy, another young one. An evangelist who was some of our training in England, and he told me afterwards. In fact, a young guy who's now, God is working through him in Europe in an amazing way. He came to some of the training in England for evangelists. He later told me God spoke to him so powerfully through that training. He went to his room one day, got on his knees, and just kind of gave himself afresh to God. He went back. He's a missionary in Spain, He's from Brazil originally, a missionary in Spain, and started a ministry which has impacted so many thousands of young people in Spain. Also replicated what we were doing in the UK, and even this weekend as we meet, they're meeting 40 evangelists, young evangelists meeting in Spain, in Madrid, coming together. This has now been going for about 8 years. Just incredible how God will speak through simple training, really. And have we got ears to hear? This young man just heard God's voice, and it just multiplies out, doesn't it? And we don't see even a fraction of it, but you get these glimpses, and you think, how exciting. I think back to when I left the bank, knew no one in Europe, and today the History Makers in Europe touches 28 plus countries. The Young Evangelist training is in 6 countries at the moment, and tell you, it's really nothing to do with me, and you'll know that from ministry, nothing to do with me. God has just opened door after door and taken young people, and anyway, I could talk for ages, but it's like exciting.
Well, part of my desire for you to come and then to people to hear your story is really my heart for our church is really along the lines of what you're talking about, in this, just in the sense that so many, we can get so caught up in just normal church stuff that we lose sight of the gospel. And it's really I'm super passionate about it, to the point to where I know it probably drives a lot of our people crazy, but we have all these people around us who are dying, and they need to be presented with the gospel so they can choose what you just said a minute ago. It's that choose life over death, and it's a burden. I mean, it's just a super burden for me, and I know for our pastoral team and a lot of our lay leadership as well. And it's really a new direction for our congregation, because what we're experiencing today is what Europe experienced in London and in England some years ago. Now that secularism is really taking hold here. I mean, it's taken hold. We are certainly post-Christian, and we're not trying to prop up a denomination or to promote religious activities. We are trying to the promotion of the gospel so that people can understand that choosing life over death. And I think what's so passionate about, for me personally, and what I want for our staff and our congregation, is to understand that your story and my story is not just for the professional Christians.
Absolutely.
It's for every single person, and how God has a plan and a purpose for each individual as it connects to the greater thing that God's doing in the gospel and where He's planted them, right? Yeah. And when we just turn around and look around us, there are so many people right there in our own sphere of influence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't it amazing throughout history, God has just taken ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Just looking for someone who will say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." And the mission field is right as soon as you walk out the front door. Our prayer is for our teams, and our team in London is, Lord, stir that sense of urgency within me. Help me to love people as you love them. We can get so caught up with our own lives, can't we? And the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. And we find in London that when you talk with people, actually the people are more open than we give them credit for. We can build the walls, can't we, and say they're not interested, but actually talk to people one-on-one. There is a hunger there. There is a hunger, but who's telling them? Martin, thanks for just being here today and taking the time to share your testimony, what God's doing in your life and through your life in Europe. And we're just proud to be able to partner with you in ministry. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.